Welcome to 3x5 News, Views, and Reviews. Scribble on index cards. We get in and we get out fast. So, keep up. Let's begin with a short review. The new film, Eddington, has been attracting attention, much of it positive. Director Ari Aster previously made two films, horror adjacent, Hereditary and Midsommar, that are among my favorites of this century. But his third film, The Overlong Bow is Afraid, was dreadful. It starred Joaquin Phoenix, whined throughout the whole movie. Okay, every artist is allowed a misstep. I was sure Aster would bounce back with Eddington, starring Phoenix again, as well as Pedro Pascal and Emma Stone. Its setting during the start of COVID sounded promising. A friend of my wife who works at the local art house gave her free tickets. We jumped at the opportunity. This is where I must bring the review to a premature close. Spoiler alert, maybe they failed to keep the film canon in his store's refrigerator or something, because the movie arrives already spoiled. To be more exact, any movie that ends in a massacre screams that the writer, in this case director Aster himself, ran out of ideas. I walked out. Now, onto Trump, the man many call Donald Trump, because they don't want to call him President Trump. He has drawn much praise for his recent display of a modicum of sympathy for Ukraine, especially since heretofore he treated Ukraine as if it and not Russia were the aggressor. On a couple of occasions, Trump said that after speaking with his ride or die, Vladimir, he told his wife in name only, Melania, about the calls. She allegedly responded by pointing out that Russia continued to bomb Ukrainian civilians. While it seems plausible that as an Eastern European she would be concerned about Russia invading Ukraine, what's not plausible is, considering her usual iciness toward him, that she actually speaks to her husband. Nor can I imagine her even texting him. If there are occasions when she needs to ask him something, she no doubt communicates via her chief of staff. Still, the concept that either of them is in possession of an actual heart is a stretch. That said, exactly why did Russia mount massive drone and missile strikes after at least two of these calls with Trump? Each was an obvious slap in the face to Trump. The attacks were no doubt planned in advance, but why didn't Putin order his commanding officers to stand down after the calls? If the end result was Trump's siding with Ukraine for the time being anyway, how did such a show of contempt benefit Putin and Russia? In the end, as with Trump, it's a mistake to attribute rationality to Putin. The invasion of Ukraine was a symptom of someone who lives in dreamland rather than in the real world. In other words, when he launched massive strikes after the calls with Trump, it was probably just because he couldn't help himself, reverting to form. Also because of how easily he games Trump, he has an innate contempt of Trump and thinks he can get away with anything when it comes to him. Meanwhile, I can't tell you how odd it is to me that someone who grew up in the 50s, such as Trump, can be so Russia-friendly, while I, just 4 years younger than him, later learned that the U.S. played a part in hyping the Cold War, and I celebrated the Reagan-Gorbachev summits. They seemed like a dream at the time. That Russia was not just the enemy, but an existential threat to the U.S. was written in stone, ingrained in us Americans. From how embarrassed we were by the Soviet Union when it reached space first with the launch of the Sputnik satellite, to vastly inflated estimates of the size of Russia's nuclear arsenal, to its oppression of the Iron Curtain, to its influence on other nations such as Cuba and Angola, to its invasion of Afghanistan. As for Trump, you might think he was such a self-centered kid and later immersed in the business world that all this barely registered. In fact, he paid attention to the issue of nuclear arms control and actually sought to become Reagan's, quote, Trump's words, indispensable nuclear negotiator, art of the deal and all that. But perhaps, like many in the West, he bought into the end of the Cold War rhetoric when the Soviet Union dissolved, and that it was now okay to be on good terms with Russia since it was no longer a communist country. Also, of course, it screamed economic opportunity. Russia's new friends in the U.S. and the West at large failed to pivot when, under Putin, Russia became worse than the Soviet Union ever was. Even when you factor in the Afghanistan invasion, the Iron Fist never crashed down as hard on other countries as it did on Ukraine. Russia's new friends include not only those on the right, but some on the extreme left, and this is disgusting, who buy into the Russia hoax, which is what they call, however proven, Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Meanwhile, in a return of the Red Scare, when Americans were persecuted for any sympathies that they may or may not have demonstrated for communism, today's liberals are viewed by many on the right as the new communists. Two could play that game. I submit that Americans who are soft on Russia and admire Putin for his supposed manliness or Christian nationalism or whatever are themselves pinkos, which is what Americans who were thought to be Russia-friendly were once called, or, let's call a spade, they are commies following their fearless leader, Comrade Trump. As far as Trump pivoting on Ukraine, slow your roll. It's difficult to pinpoint who in the administration is devising these policies, but the U.S. is not actually providing Ukraine with military aid. We are selling new weapons to European countries, which would use them to replace the old ones in their arsenals, which they would then pass on to Ukraine. Big whoop. But isn't the Trump administration threatening huge tariffs to deter countries that buy Russian oil, its main source of revenue to fund the war, from continuing to do so? Yes, but it is waiting 50 days before instituting the tariffs. 50 days, during which hundreds more heroic Ukrainians, not to mention multiples of wretched Russian soldiers, will die. However heartless and timid that makes it look, the administration, besides Trump's congenital reluctance to antagonize Russia, does have an apparent reason: to avoid further antagonizing China, which buys said oil. Until now, it's as if Trump held a grudge against Ukraine because it was inconveniencing him by not ending the war in terms favorable to Russia. I think his recent softening toward Ukraine is due to his irritation with Putin, as well as concern that he would look like he has totally abandoned Ukraine, which many Republicans support. Essentially, as with everything else, Trump is a bundle of unresolved conflicts. If you must attribute any coherence to his policy on Ukraine, it's that he's waiting for Ukraine to lose, so, as much on his own behalf as that of the U.S., he can conduct business with Russia in areas such as, thanks perplexity, artificial intelligence, minerals and rare earths, oil and gas development in the Russian Arctic, and investment in the shipping corridor through there, which would include port facilities, Port Trump, and icebreaker fleets, the SS Trump. And let's not forget the obligatory golf course, such as Trump International Golf Course, Moscow. Yes, golf is actually a thing in Russia. Of course, instead of golf balls, they use potatoes. Sorry, couldn't resist. Guess I'm still fixated on the old Soviet Union. The big but ugly bill allocated $28 billion to ICE. Notice how suddenly everybody knows that ICE stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Imagine if some of that was allocated to Ukrainian defense. As I often say, we should be paying Ukraine because they are not only fighting for themselves, but for the U.S. and the whole Western world. Would you rather it was American young people fighting on the front lines and the drone lines, or whatever you want to call them? Finally, if Ukraine is lost because of Trump, history will not look kindly on him, especially if it leads to attacks on the Baltic states or, drumroll, Poland. Can you spell World War?